Welcome to Hidden Scriptures Word Study Commentary number 169. The topic I want to talk about today is, do we fall from grace and lose our salvation if we obey the Father? This is essentially what Christians have been taught to believe their whole church-going life. The book of Galatians is a minefield of misunderstood passages from Paul that has caused believers today to have a walk of faith that is completely devoid of anything that resembles the keeping and obeying of the spoken words of the Father that are contained in the Mosaic Law, the Torah. Since the Great Purge orchestrated by Constantine at the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, believers have been taught by their antinomian pastors and teachers that obeying the spoken words of the Father, words containing his instructions, his teachings, his guidelines, and his rules on how he wants his people to live and conduct themselves in order to be peculiar and set apart from the rest of the world, that obeying these words would cause them to fall from grace and lose their salvation. As ludicrous and insane as this sounds, the vast majority of those claiming to be followers of the Messiah today believe this to be true. And this is the reason why the type of Christian that we are surrounded by today are antinomian and have no desire in their hearts to obey the Mosaic Law, the Torah, while the type of Christian we had in the first and second centuries were the complete and exact opposite. Even though the Messiah has instructed his followers to obey the Mosaic Law, the Torah, the type of Christian we have surrounding us today refuses to obey. Here is what the Messiah instructed his followers then and now to do concerning their relationship with the Mosaic Law. Matthew 23, 1 through 3. Then Yahushua spoke to the crowds and to his disciples, his followers, saying, the scribes and Pharisees have seated themselves in the seat of Moses, which represents their authority as teachers of the law. So practice and observe and obey everything they tell you from the law, but do not do as they do. For they teach things from the law, but they do not practice these same things themselves. Note, unlike the followers of Messiah back then, who had to attend synagogue to hear the Torah read and taught to them, almost every follower of Messiah today has their own personal copy of the Torah in their Bibles. It is a fruitless and foolish endeavor for someone with an antinomian mindset to read the writings of Paul and believe that they fully understand what he is saying. Why do I say this? Because Paul did not live, did not think, did not write, or did not teach with this same mindset. When a believer shuns and rejects this antinomian mindset that they have been taught to have by their antinomian pastors and teachers, Paul's writings are then able to be correctly and properly understood. To fully and properly understand Paul is to realize that he did not teach against obedience to the Mosaic Law, only that this obedience is not to be considered as the means for receiving salvation. That is what legalism is. And legalism is something Paul always taught against. He always taught that salvation was only by having faith and trust in the Messiah. Obedience to the Mosaic law, the Torah, would follow afterwards as a result of hearing and obeying our Messiah. The two go hand in hand, and neither one does a person any good if they are isolated and apart from each other. What am I talking about? I'm talking about faith and obedience. I'm talking about faith and work. We can find that in Yaakov, Jacob. We call him James, chapter 2, verses 20 and 26. Unfortunately for believers today, if they're unwilling to shun and reject their antinomianism, which is lawlessness, they will never be able to properly and correctly understand the writings and teachings of Paul concerning the Mosaic law, the Torah. And this is what separates and distinguishes today's Gentile followers of Messiah from the early 1st and 2nd century Gentile followers of Messiah who were not antinomian and are on record as attending synagogue on the Sabbath to learn the Torah in order to have a walk of faith that included obedience to the Torah. Okay, the evidence is right there in your own Bibles, folks. I've got some of the passages right there for you to write down if you are interested. Okay, so let's look at two of the several passages in the minefield of Galatians that causes so many believers today to have a walk of faith that is devoid of anything resembling being obedient to the spoken words of the Father that are contained in the Torah, the Mosaic law. Galatians chapter 2, verse 21. I do not set aside and frustrate the grace of Elohim. For if righteousness is through the law, then Messiah died for nothing. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4. You who are trying to be justified by Torah, the law, have been cut off from Messiah. You have fallen from grace. To fully and correctly understand what Shaul, Paul, is saying in the passages above, let's compare his comments concerning the Mosaic law above with what he said about the Mosaic law in his letter to the Romans. We read this just a moment ago, Galatians 2, verses 21. Do I set aside and frustrate the grace of Elohim? For if righteousness is through the law, then Messiah died for nothing. Romans 2:26. Therefore, if the uncircumcision, talking about the nations, the Gentiles, keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? Okay, so we have Paul up here, Shaul, saying if righteousness is through the law, then we have him down here saying the righteousness of the law. Okay, Galatians 5:4. You who are trying to be justified by Torah, by law, have been cut off from Messiah. You have fallen from grace. Romans 2:13. For it is not the hearers of Torah, the law, who are righteous before Elohim. Rather, it is the doers of Torah, of the law, who will be justified. Okay, so we have Paul saying, you who are trying to be justified by Torah, and then we have him down here saying it is the doers of Torah who will be justified. Is Shaul, Paul, contradicting himself? No, not at all. He is merely speaking to two different groups of people with a completely different set of circumstances. The assemblies in Galatia had been infiltrated and infested by men who were either Pharisees or sent by the Pharisees, who were attempting to undermine the preaching of Paul by causing confusion concerning the receiving of salvation. Whereas the assemblies in Rome had escaped all this confusion because they had not been infiltrated and infested by these men due to its geographical location. In trying to understand what had happened as a result of this infiltration and infestation of the Pharisees in the assemblies in Galatia, let's look at a few other passages. Galatians chapter 1, verse 7b. This is, of course, Shaul talking. Evidently, some people are troubling and throwing you into confusion and are trying to pervert the gospel of Messiah. Galatians chapter 4 and verse 17. These people are zealous to win you over, but for no good. What they want is to alienate you from us so that you may have zeal for them. So who were these people? This was the same group of people, the same group of men that, as I mentioned before, were either Pharisees or had been sent out by the Pharisees, whose purpose it was to follow a few days or weeks behind Paul on his missionary journeys, which were 3 in total to the region of Galatia, to cause trouble and confusion among the new Gentile converts there. These were the same people, the same men that we read about in the book of Acts, who were causing trouble and confusion with the assemblies in Antioch and the new Gentile converts there. We read about this in Acts chapter 15. Certain people came down from Judea to Antioch and were teaching the believers, unless you are circumcised according to the custom taught by Moses, you cannot be saved. Okay, dropping down to verse 5. Then some of the believers who belonged to the party of the Pharisees stood up and said the Gentiles must be circumcised and required to keep the law of Moses before they can be saved. These same men were insisting that unless the grown men among the new Gentile converts were physically circumcised according to the Abrahamic covenant that we read about in Genesis chapter 17, verses 9 through 14, that they could not be saved, that they could not receive salvation. Well, these poor Gentiles wanted to do the right thing, but they didn't know which way to turn. They had come out of their familiar comfort zone of paganism by the preaching of Shaul about the Messiah, wherein he preached to them that salvation was by faith and faith alone. Shaul, Paul, then departed the region, and in comes these Pharisees who told them no, salvation was not possible unless the men became circumcised first. Well, not knowing which way to turn, some of them stayed with what Paul had taught them. Some of them were trying to do what the Pharisees were now telling them to do. And some of them simply threw up their hands and went back to their familiar comfort zone of paganism. Okay, Galatians 1, verses 6 and 7. Paul is saying, I am amazed that you are so quickly turning away from the one who called you by the grace of Messiah to a different good news, to a different gospel. Not that there is another, but only some who are confusing you and want to distort the good news gospel of Messiah. The purpose of Shaul's letter was to remind them that the good news gospel message of Messiah that he had preached to them, that salvation was by faith and faith alone, that this was the only good news gospel message. Okay, Galatians 1 verses 8 and 9. But even if we or an angel or messenger came down from heaven should announce any good news gospel to you other than what we have proclaimed to you, let that person be cursed. As we have said before, and now I repeat, if anyone proclaims to you a good news other than what you received from us, let that person be under a curse. Shaul, Paul, knew full well who these men were who were causing this trouble and confusion. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 12. It is those who want to look good outwardly. This is describing to a T your typical Pharisee. Okay, they always made a big showing of outward appearances. So Paul knew exactly who these men were. It is those who want to look good outwardly, who are trying to get you to be circumcised. The only reason they are doing it is to escape persecution for preaching about the Messiah's execution stake, his cross. Verse 13, for even those men, speaking about the Pharisees, who are already circumcised, don't observe, keep, and obey the Torah. And that's a known fact. I mean, that's all throughout Matthew. The Messiah made it clear. Even Yohanan, John made it clear. John the Immerser, Yohanan the Immerser made it clear that the Pharisees did not observe, keep, and obey the Torah. That's common knowledge, folks. On the contrary, they, the antinomian Pharisees, want you to get circumcised so that they can boast of having gained your adherence. Paul went on to inform these folks in his letter that if they went along with what these men who were causing trouble and confusion were telling them, which was that salvation was not possible until they had become physically circumcised first, then they have rejected the truth that he had preached to them, which was that salvation was by faith in Messiah and faith in Messiah alone. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 2. Notice, it is I, Shaul, who tells you that if you receive circumcision as a supposed requirement of salvation, Messiah will be of no benefit to you, for you will lack the faith in Messiah that is necessary for salvation. Once more, I solemnly affirm to every man who receives circumcision as a supposed requirement of salvation that he is under obligation and required to keep the whole law if keeping the law is required before you can receive salvation. These next statements from Shaul was one of the reasons why the religious elite had such hatred and animosity towards him, the person who used to be among them. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 6. For if we are in Messiah Yahushua, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision means anything, but only faith activated and expressed and working through love. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 15. For neither is circumcision anything of any importance, nor uncircumcision, but only a new creation, a new creature, which is the result of a new birth, which is the result of being born again, a spiritual transformation, a new nature in Messiah Yahushua. Now, folks, that is saying a lot there. That is right there. That verse, that single verse is a whole nother word study in and of itself, which, Father willing, I will do next, because that is gold right there. Okay, footnote to go along with Galatians chapter 6 and verse 15. Write down these scripture passages here if you want to do any further study on this topic. So when taking into consideration the circumstances that Shaul was having to address in his letter to the assemblies in Galatia, I personally have added notes to my Bible, and I now read the passages this way. I do not nullify and frustrate the grace of Elohim. For if righteousness comes through the Torah apart from faith in Messiah, then Messiah died for no reason. Okay, Galatians chapter 5 and verse 4. You who are trying to be justified by Torah apart from faith in Messiah have been cut off from Messiah. You have fallen from grace. Once Paul's letter to the Galatians is correctly and properly understood, then the stumbling block that was set in place centuries earlier by antinomian pastors and teachers for the purpose of causing believers to have a walk of faith devoid of anything resembling being obedient to the spoken words of the Father that are contained in the Mosaic law, the Torah, this stumbling block will be removed. Christians today can relax and be at ease in their hearts and minds about embracing a new lifestyle of walking in obedience to the spoken words of the Father, words containing His instructions, His teachings, His guidelines, and His rules on how He wants His people to live and conduct themselves in order to be peculiar and set apart from the rest of the world. They can be rest assured that obedience to His spoken words will most certainly not cause them to fall from grace and lose their salvation. In fact, on the contrary, obedience to His words that are contained in the Torah, the Mosaic law, accompanied by faith and trust in His Son, our Messiah, is what sets us on the narrow path that leads to eternal life. Okay, folks, that is what I wanted to get across to you guys today. I appreciate you guys who watch my videos faithfully. Every time I post one, you guys watch them. I appreciate that. And for someone who is new, and if this is the first commentary from me that you have heard, I really appreciate you being here, and I hope you come back. So we will be with you again in the next Hidden Scriptures Word Study Commentary. And I really appreciate you guys being here. I love you guys, and shalom to you and your family.